If you hear that, black is beautiful. Santa Claus. Black is beautiful. It's a textile. Lift your head like me. You got to wear your collar with dignity. How it was out. Black is beautiful. I said, sing it along. Black is beautiful. Say, I'm black and proud. It's high time that we get rid of that old slave mentality.
Or sometimes even fourth generation African, many of whom lived on company plantations. And it's really not after Kofi's death of suicide in the early fall of 1763 that ethnic conflict among the insurgents becomes crippling. So Governor Kofi and his second in command, Captain Accra, organized an army and a government that enforced compliance with their rule, neutralized opponents, whether among the enslaved or the Dutch, and they crafted strategy. They collected supplies and weapons from all the plantations so they could redistribute them to their followers and soldiers. They forced people on company plantations, many of whom, as I said, were Creoles, into the fields to make rum. And they set others to work in kitchen gardens so that they could feed the rebel soldiers. Rebel officers and officials were attended by servants and slaves. And the Amina created a rebellion that was not egalitarian. No rebellions in the 18th century were, but hierarchical. And like most rebellions and revolutions, they employed both coercion and violence to get people to comply with their rule. That's what you do. And in a series of letters to the Dutch governor, as I mentioned, Governor Kofi laid out his very bold vision of freedom. He proposed to the Dutch that they would divide the colony in two. He and his people would take the southernmost half, leaving the part adjoining the coast to the Dutch. Now, Kofi was not the first self-liberated African man in the Americas to engage in negotiations with colonial enemies. Formal negotiations between Maroons and colonial authorities were quite common, and there are numerous examples of peace treaties between escaped African self-emancipated people and Europeans starting in the early 1500s. Kofi probably knew about the treaties that the British had concluded with Maroons in Jamaica in 1739 and 1740, or the treaties Maroons had made with the Dutch authorities in neighboring Suriname as recently as 1760 and 1762. But Kofi was proposing an agreement on a much grander scale. He initiated the negotiations, not the colonial authorities, and his tone in the letters is that of one governor speaking to another head of state, right? One head of state speaking to another. His proposal to divide that colony in half was bold and unprecedented. Kofi did not offer to retreat with his people to the jungle and live in little villages as Maroons in Suriname had done. Rather, he suggested living alongside the Dutch as equals, as one nation next to another. Governor Kofi made clear that he wanted free trade with any ship that called on the colony, and it appears, can't be certain, but it appears that he was not after freedom and subsistence Maroon style, but had in mind a plantation export, agriculture, and trade. Governor Kofi wanted to keep sugar plantations in production, it looks like, likely with forced labor, as he did during the rebellion, because no self-emancipated people wanted to work in the sugar fields of their own free will, and that he intended to grow sugar to distill rum for the rebels' own consumption, but likely also to sell on the European market, just as Dutch colonists did. Some 30 years later, after their rebellion succeeded, leaders in Haiti would insist on the same thing, compelling newly liberated people to grow sugar on plantations. For a number of reasons we can talk about in question and answers having to do with, among other things, foreign exchange. Well, Governor Kofi's radical vision turned his rebellion into a real revolution, I would argue. His vision likely turned off many of the rank and file. And in fact, African descended people's responses to the rebellion and their alignments ran the gamut from strong support to evasion and dodging. They made such decisions, as you may imagine, based on their own personal circumstances. Did they have kids? Did they have old people they had to take care of? Social tensions on their own plantations. If you hated the plantation leadership and they were rebels, you might not want to be part of that rebellion. As well as larger ideological, political, and strategic considerations. Few people sided with the Dutch. Many more joined the rebels. Most robbed their plantation houses, taking back what their own labor had created. But whatever their sympathies, in terms of committing themselves to rebellion, many dodged, right? They remained aloof where possible, attempting to stay autonomous or holding off on choosing sides until they had no choice. By their own accounts, they hid in the rainforest and savanna behind their plantations as soon as the Dutch or rebels or Amerindians approached, and they moved back to their plantations when they thought the coast was clear. Now, I suggest that hiding from the rebels was not merely a fearful refusal to participate in rebellion, although of course fear played a role. How could it not, right? But I think that many people avoided joining the rebels because they preferred a life without masters, whether they were Dutch or African. Like self-governing people throughout history, they sought to evade war, the appropriation of their labor, and outside rule. In dodging all combatants, people became fugitives in their own backyards, living independently of both the Dutch and the rebels. They camped in their own communities near their food gardens and near plantation food pantries, engaging in subsistence agriculture that did not require any coercion. And that alternative, I think, especially for women, children, and the less able-bodied, was preferable to joining a military campaign or being incorporated into the rebellion potentially as workers. As one man put it, he did not want to be anyone's slave, and so he stayed home. I think that such preferences were probably also fueled by people's experiences back in Africa. The Atlantic slave trade fomented very powerful, hierarchical, and militarized states in West Africa in the 18th century, and many West Africans had grown wary of rulers who appropriated their labor through taxes, turned their sons into soldiers, and fed growing numbers of captives to Europeans on the coast. And I think it's likely that such memories fueled people's reluctance to join a hierarchical rebellion. They were happy to see the Dutch go, but they did not want to be coerced by a new set of rulers. Now, as I said, in the fall of 1763, Governor Kofi was deposed in a coup and committed ritual suicide, which was required of some West African leaders when they lost the support of their officers as a way to stop bloodshed and maintain honor. And Kofi, as I said, had sought to reproduce a Dutch-style colony, an independent state. But with his death, that notion of an independent state died. Kofi's successor, Atta, had his own designs for a centralized style of command, and many of his officers rejected his authoritarian ways and became his adversaries. And it seems likely that many.
And good evening and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101. Of course, Wednesdays we spend time looking at African Guyanese history, African Guyanese culture. And today we want to continue the conversation we began last week. Uh, Coming in there with an excerpt from the riveting presentation made by Professor Cars last weekend on Saturday at the Theatre Guild, an event sponsored by ITPAD G. And of course, lots of people were there and lots of others joined online, and we played there an excerpt from our presentation, and we'll continue our discussion which we began last week now that we have heard Professor Carr's presentation, and would like to welcome all of you wherever you're joining us from, whether you're joining us from in Guyana, in Berbice, Kanji. Welcome to Politics 101. We would like to welcome Puran, who is saying, good evening from Region 2. I'm visually impaired, learning a lot from your program. This text is by my granddaughter, Puran. Thank you, Puran, for joining our program, and that you are learning. One can never know because people use all kinds of aliases, but we can assume from the name here that Puran is Indo-Guyanese, and it makes a big difference when our Indian Guyanese brothers and sisters can find a program like this useful. In fact, all Guyanese should find all programs of this nature useful, but given our ethnic divide, a lot of Indo-Guyanese may be dissuaded from joining a program like this. But the evidence suggests differently. I have run into so many Indian Guyanese. First of all, they recognize me, and secondly, they talk about Politics 101, which says that a lot of our Indo-Guyanese brothers and sisters do listen and view this program. They may be quiet and for obvious reasons, and so therefore Puran is one of those who has made it known. Puran, I'm very glad that you are finding the program useful, because I think this is part of what we do in building a nation. I have always felt that one of the drawbacks in societies like ours is how little we know about each other. How little we know about each other. How little African Guyanese know about Indian Guyanese history, and they may know something about the culture, but very little about the history, and vice versa. How little we know about our indigenous peoples and their diverse cultures. Of course, we think that all indigenous people are Amerindians, which is so, but not the ethnic divide and so on. So I'm very glad. Because this program is really a Guyanese program. A lot of times we do it through the lens of African Guyanese, but at the end of the day, it's a Guyanese program, and we're very glad that there is diversity in the audience. Good evening. Please share the link. We have a big panel tonight. We have, as usual, Brother Chief Eric Phillips, Sister sorry about that. Sister Olive Sampson, the CEO of IPADG, is here. And we are also joined by Brother Gerald Pereira, who is a Pan-Africanist and a socialist. And, I listen to other programs, and, I grew up here in my auntie and the big people in the village. They say, well, ignorance is bliss, is folly to be wise. And, a lot of people talk about Pan-Africanism, and they talk about it outside of context. And sometimes our people are very, we have manners, let me say that, and you don't want to offend your host. And I see my brother Gerald struggle on other programs because he's talking to people who are not familiar with the ideological thrust of African thinkers and activists and so on. It's a kind of they kind of come to us in a monolithic way, and so if someone is a black rights activist, they think that all you're interested in black nationalism, and they don't take into consideration the other elements that go in to the framing and constructing of a black worldview. I had to point out to Ravi Dev and others the other day that there is a broad African narrative, the narrative of suffering, which they are now familiar with because black people are crying out, and we hear that narrative every day. But there's an integrationist narrative, African narrative, and I had to be very crude in saying that, when Sidney King talked about joint premiership, and Eric Phillips and others talk about power sharing. Who are we sharing power? Cat? A dog? It's an integrationist aspect of the African narrative. And of course, there is also the socialist aspect of the African narrative. A lot of African people gravitated to socialism, not because of Karl Marx, but because of the African, the African tradition, which predated Karl Marx, the African tradition of inclusiveness, the African tradition of sharing. Bob Marley talked about, I remember when we used to sit around the fire and drink call me, part of which I share with you, and he was making there a statement of African socialism, and so Africans generally gravitate socialism because of the African experience. And decades ago, people like Nkrumah and so on talked about African socialism. And the argument was that we were socialists long before Karl Marx. And, I usually tell people I learned nothing about African socialism from Karl Marx. In fact, I and black thinkers could teach Karl Marx a lot about socialism, CLR James, one of our idols, will always talk about his trip to Mexico to meet with Leon Trotsky, who was one of the two major leaders of the Russian Revolution after Lenin died. It was Stalin and Trotsky, of course, was banished, sent away. he eventually ended up in Mexico, and that's where he was murdered by the Russians and so forth, the Soviets. And James, would say, and I went there and I told Trotsky, you do not understand the Negro question. You socialists, you all do not understand the Negro question. And I told him and I explained to him the Negro question. C.L.R. James, telling Trotsky about the Negro question, So I make that point sometimes because people do not understand the African worldview. And they think the African worldview is a kind of anti-Indian worldview and a kind of anti-white worldview and so on, and not a worldview that arises out of the African, the whole African experience. I always look at my students when I teach ancient Egypt, antiquity as they call it, and I tell them how matriarchal the society was, that women owned property, women run things, and you can see their eyes light up because present day experience does not necessarily suggest that, And I think it was yesterday I was making the point in class that the female-headed household that is usually seen as a negative aspect of the African experience. In another way, we Africans are not afraid of female authority, largely because we are socializing those female-headed households. Even when the men were there, and the men are there, women still run things, I hardly heard, growing up in my village, waiting till your father come home for bust your ass. No, the women bust your ass. And if the father come home, he might get he bust ass too, And so coming out of what they see and project as a negative thing about the African condition, women-headed household and so on and thing. And African people, as a result of that, we are not fearful as others about female authority. You see? So welcome to you all, and please share the link, please share the live, because our discussion tonight is going to be quite intense, as it always is. So let me welcome our guests, and let's get started with our discussion. Brother Eric Phillips, Sister Olive Sampson, and Brother Gerald Pereira. Brothers, sister, good evening. Welcome to another edition of Politics 101.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. And, good evening to your guests.
Yes, and I know all of you are aware of the presentation made by Professor Marjolaine Cars last weekend at the Theatre Guild, and I think even for us who are familiar with the Bourbese Revolution, I think what she brought to bear on the discussion, quite apart from new information for the broad population, for me, what was outstanding about our presentation was the analysis that she brought to this subject. I have heard historians in my time talk about the Bourbese rebellion and revolution, and they would talk about the revolution that Kofi was defeated. Kofi committed suicide. You heard very little that Kofi negotiated with the Dutch. You heard very little about his statecraft. You heard very little about his military prowess. And so you heard these things, the revolution was defeated. They didn't even call it a revolution. It was a revolt, and so on and so forth. So she not only presented facts, very importantly, she gave you the context in which this whole thing played out. And so her analysis is fresh. And uh, uh, brothers and sisters, there is no substitute for getting your hands on primary documents and getting a sense of the background, getting a sense of the context. Then it enriches your analysis and really presents almost as if she's talking about something new to a lot of us who have been familiar with that. Olive, is my assessment on spot, and the same for Eric, and I hope Gerald comes back shortly.
Yeah, you're spot on. Absolutely. I mean, what we heard from Professor Cars, and I hope that your listening audience will read the book. What we heard from her was the kind of respectful narrative, the kind of respectful presentation of the history of a people that we should have had from the inception. We have been imbued, we have been indoctrinated with a history that is being told was told to us by those who conquered us and had no care to share with us the dignity with which our people fought, the sense of their military skills, their sense, their understanding of diplomacy and engaging in negotiations, their statecraft, their ability to organize government, to establish governance. I mean, what she brought to us on Saturday evening, I think, was truly empowering. And two things that come out to me: one, the fact that she had the luxury of being able to research this in Dutch for over a period of 15 years. 15 years worth of work led to that book, and we relied on her to do it. We must fight immediately to ensure that historians are see their that people interested in studying history. Let me start from there. Not only the ones who are current historians, but people who wish to study history do not feel that it's a dead end. Our society must value the research and the work that goes into putting together a narrative based, as you said, on primary sources, a respectful narrative, particularly of people of African descent. We must support our historians. We must support students to study. And that means government support of the research. The National Trust should be focused on not only the preservation of buildings, but the preservation of the story, the preservation of the facts. The archives should be able to utilize the access it currently has to all of these records that are in the Dutch archives, but in Dutch. So there's a lot of work to be done. And you know, David, there's a twist to this. This is the interesting part. Ipadaji did this because of the fact that we have a commitment to the telling of the history of people of African descent in Guyana and the history of Guyana writ large, but in a more accurate way. So we are committed to ensuring that students from nursery to tertiary have an opportunity to learn a true and honest history that leaves everyone feeling that they have been respectfully represented in that narrative. That's the first thing. The second thing, the reason that IPADG does this, the UN decade recognition is critical. Recognition of a people. And so recognition, justice, and development. This falls within the goal of recognition. But thirdly, the history of Guyana is bifurcated in many ways. The early history, the history from our arrival in the early 1600s, 1627 or before, until 1838 is largely ignored. It is largely ignored. Over 200 years, Africans were in this country, and the foundations of this country, the very canals, sea defenses, reclaimed land, everything that the economy depended upon was built in that 200-year period. But we ignore it completely. And so that is one of the reasons that we sponsor this and will continue to sponsor programs that focus on a history that is being lost, with a preference for 1838 and beyond. And you can imagine why 1838.
And before I bring in Gerald and then Eric, I just want to say a couple of things. One of the things I learned from Walter Rodney is that, you know, history and sociology and political science and all these things, that one brings to it a political agenda. That is, what are you presenting African Guyanese history to answer what? And Rodney insists, you know, it's a political agenda. It's how Europe and the developed Africa brought a new methodology to the reading of African history. And you talked to him and he said, but it was intentional. That is why when he presented the manuscript to his advisor, the advisor dismissed it as a political pamphlet. You know, and today it's one of the consequential books of African history because Rodney was intentional that he is studying and writing African history with a political agenda, and the political agenda is to tell the story from the African standpoint. And I think we in Guyana and the wider Caribbean are a little bit slow in that regard, and it's good to see that this professor is helping us to really understand that when you come to something like the slave, these so-called slave rebellions, that if you have a political agenda, then you present them in a certain way. C.L.R. James is Black Jacobins. People refer to it as romantic and all of that. But what he did was he humanized that revolution and put the rebels, you know, on even keel with so-called Europeans. And that's why he talked about the Black Jacobins. And again, you know, our people do not do very much of that intentional history. You know, when you think about Kofi, you think of him as a rebel leader, but you don't think of it. We don't think of him as a statesman, which he was, as a commander in chief, which he was. You see, and I think this moment for me is an opportunity for us to begin to present our history in a certain way. I know in a place like Guyana, if you present African history in a certain way, people automatically think that you are talking about an African superiority. Or if you present Indian history in a certain way, people think that you're talking about Indian supremacy. And we have to make a distinction between supremacist narratives and narratives that have to do with humanizing people who had lost their humanity by law. By law, they did not lose their humanity as human beings. They always had that. You know, Stokely Carmichael Faith, Brother Kwame Ture famously said after the passage of the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act, when they asked him about how it will benefit Black Americans, he said, well, you know, those laws are not for us. We always knew we were
Some
equal.
water, please.
It was white people who didn't know that we were equal. And so it is for them, you know. So I just wanted to stitch that in as I come over to Gerald and then Eric to really talk about this kind of fresh lens that is now, you know, put on the Berbice Rebellion. Of course, it's put by a white woman, and we are still in that mode. That is, a lot of these things, sometimes it takes foreigners, it takes white people before we are jolted, and I am aware of that. But the fact of the matter is that this book and the presentation over the weekend really, I think, opened up possibilities to take what a lot of us have been doing in a quiet way to take it to another level. Gerald Pereira.
David, before, may I just comment on one thing that you just said?
Yeah.
Yes, it was a white woman, but we must remember, I think that should remind us that we need to teach Dutch so that we can access information that is in Dutch and in Old Dutch too. So I don't want us to I would hope that we don't get caught up in her race, but in what we need to do, which is to get access through the study of the language in which our history is written.
Yes, point well taken. I'm Gerald Pereira, and then Eric Phillips, Chief Eric. Gerald, your audio is not on. I think Gerald is gone there. Eric, let's proceed with you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, David. Good night, Olive. First, let me thank you for your introductory narrative to Puran, because it provides a context that is very important that's lost. Because many people believe that because of the persons on this program, that they're talking about African superiority, when indeed we're talking about history. And history is really public policy. And as Professor Dans indicated, the public policy of African Guyanese, the public policy towards African Guyanese or people of African descent in Guyana, has always been the public policy of underdevelopment, which today continues. But let me also thank Professor Madeleine for her interpretation from a neutral perspective, from a scholarly perspective. She had no political agenda. She was just looking at the archives and expressing what she found there and analyzing it beautifully. Coming to Olive's point, I've been to 5 archives in Holland. The one she got these letters from are in Den Haag. It's Old Dutch, but it's beautifully protected because the Dutch saw slavery as a business. And so if they sent out a pound of sugar on a ship, it's recorded. I remember in the archives in Den Haag, I saw a book with beautiful handwriting that had 273 captured Africans being sold for 57,000 florins. And they had the names of who they were, and the descriptions were just fascinating. Also, I'd like to point out that history is not taught in our schools. So this experience with Madeleine is very rich and points to the fact that history should be taught in the schools. UG has not created or graduated historians like UE does. If you go to Jamaica, you find a lot of historians out of UE, because history teaches you not only about the past, but it teaches you about the future. And as Madeleine indicated, Kofi learned about what happened with the Maroons. The Akupam, the Maroons in Jamaica, they had a treaty. The Maroons in Suriname had a treaty. But he took it further. And he created a new governance architecture that said, hey, you rule the north, I'll rule the south. You have the river, but let us work in partnership because I want to trade. I don't want to be living depending on you or you depending on me. I want to trade. I want to create my own state. Unfortunately, the state that he understood was the state that the Dutch also had created. And so that created some type of difficulty with those who were free and didn't want to have any other masters. I also want to say that it's interesting that the 2 critical books about our revolutions, Blood in the River, and also the book by Emilia Dakota, which is Crown of Glory, Tears of Blood, all have the word blood in it. We have shed a lot of blood for Guyana. And it's lost in our history because it's not taught in our schools. And it's purposefully not taught in our schools for political reasons. Because if our history was truly taught in our schools, we would have a different Guyana. We'd have a different appreciation of who we are and of the contributions that have been made by all of the groups in Guyana, by the indigenous people, by even the Dutch and the British, of the indentured servants, whether they're Portuguese, Chinese, Indian, German, because we did have some German indentured servants here. So we need to use this as a platform to encourage our youth to start reading about their history, about start appreciating the history of this great state. Because if they did, they would understand why we, as people of African descent, are talking about shared governance, are speaking about inclusion, especially in this time of oil. But since we do not have that historical context, we have racial entrepreneurs who are pushing superiority issues. I mean, today I was shocked to see Ravi Dev write an article about federalism, which I've responded to. And what he's basically saying is federalism solves our problem of integration into one Guyana. But federalism is such a racist architecture for Guyana. You know, Region 4 is less than 1,000 square miles. It has 40% of the population, and Region 4 and 10 are where Africans are. Regions 1, 7, 8, and 9 is 54% of Guyana, and you have less than 40,000 people living there. Regions 5, 6, 2, and 3, which are Indo-Guyanese dominated, are much larger than Region 4 and 10. So when Ravi talks about federalism, he is again reinforcing division, separation, and unshared history and unshared destiny. And what I don't understand is why people who are as intelligent as Ravi keep pushing this Indian dominant narrative. And that's because they don't understand our dignity. They don't understand what we went through in 1763, in 1823, in 1838, what we went through in building the village movement, which is the baseline structure of Guyana. So this, I was in Brazil. I didn't get to listen live to her presentation, but from what I've gathered, it was very impressive, not only in terms of the new information that was provided, but because of how she analyzed it. And most people don't realize, because it's not talked about 40 Dutch people died. But 1,800 Africans died during the 1763 rebellion. And that's perhaps why she's calling it blood in the river, because it was bloody. And it was Africans and people of African descent fighting against the Dutch in Suriname, the Dutch in Guyana, the Dutch from Barbados, the Dutch from Europe, and Amerindians. An unfair fight. So I just wanted to start with that so that Gerald could get a chance to speak. I see that his link may be lost again.
Yes, he's struggling to keep the link. Eric, that point is so well taken as we go over to Olive. And because it's 1,800 out of what, 4,500.
4,500.
4,500. I mean, you're talking about almost half of the African population in the colony. Yeah. I mean, I mean, that's a lot of blood. That's a lot of blood. 1,800 people have been murdered. It's a lot of blood to begin with, but 1,800 out of 4,500, you're talking about half of the population, the African population there being slaughtered. Look,
David, before you go to Olive, what people should also understand is why they revolted. There was starvation, there was brutality, apart from the other things of rape and branding and all of that. And people wanted their freedom. So you can imagine those who were free didn't want to go back and grow sugar.
Yes. Yeah. And as we keep pointing out here tonight, this history is not just African Guyanese history. It is that. because of the untold suffering that African Guyanese, and that African Guyanese are the ones who rose up against their suffering. But this is Guyanese history. This is about white people. This is about our native people. This is about our Indian, Portuguese, and Chinese comrades. Because as you pointed out, Eric, last week, that if Guyana had become the first sustainable Black republic, then indentureship, as we know it here, after the 1838 would not have been there. So this really is Guyanese history, all right? It's been told through, of course, the lens of African suffering, but it is Guyanese history. Now, I am telling you, I have taught for a long time in the United States of America. I am more familiar with the American Constitution than I am with the Guyanese Constitution. I mean, I can close my eye and narrate the American because I've taught it over time, because Americans insist in their education system that you think, since I was a graduate student and they would have us teach, regardless of what your major was, you had to teach, you had to teach American Constitution. So you have a sense. I, up until about 2 decades ago, a decade and a half ago, could tell you more about the American Revolution than the 1763 Revolution or the Asian Revolution. And it is because the Americans insist on teaching, and several authors write and they take a little part of it and blow it up and so on. And it is time that we in Guyana begin to do that. We in the Caribbean begin to do that. And we bring an objectivity that is subjective. All right, I am using those terms deliberately. We bring a Guyanese, a Caribbean, an African subjectivity to that so-called objectivity, because the Europeans bring what they call objectivity is European subjectivity.
Yes,
and I think here is an as I listen to that lady. I'm saying, wow, if when I was in high school, I had heard this, when I was in high school, and I heard this, not just the facts, but, like I said, the context and the interpretation. And the interpretation is an interpretation that comes from the experience of those who were butchered for daring to stand up for their freedom. Richie Rich Olive is asking here if some of the documents that Professor had access to is passed over to Padaji. Of course, you'll be able to answer that, but I want you to zero in on this linkage between our history and our education system, and how that could help to really free our country, free our society of some of the mental and psychological bondage that we've been put into by this whole thing that race, is not important, and those who talk about race are into warfare. And what's the most recent thing, Eric? We are memory warriors and all that kind of nonsense that Ravi Dev and others over that side are putting into Indian people's minds. Over to you, Olive Sampson. Your audio.
Sorry about that. No, I quite agree with you that Professor Carr's presentation and certainly the book are in many ways freeing. They bring to us a narrative that is, as I said before, a respectful narrative about our history. In her remarks, she repeatedly referred to Kofi as Governor Kofi.
Governor.
She
Governor.
never ever mentions his name without giving him his full salutation as governor. Right? The first thing we need to do, David and Eric, is stop using Coffee. And you and I, David, are members of Coffee 250. So we have got to change the name of our organization and give him his full name as an Akan man, as someone was also pointing out in your chat, right? Governor Kofi. The fact that we have not taught our history. First, I want to back up because it's not only the teaching of history. We have to make sure that the history texts, right, are well written, are accurate, and are empowering, that they inspire our youth. They must have the level of pride coming out, regardless of race. We must have a pride in what it has taken for us to build this country. You know, in the effort to control our minds, the colonial powers gave us a history. They gave us a history. And we have swallowed that, and we passed our GCE or whatever it is we were supposed to do with it, but it did not empower. In many ways, it left us feeling broken, right? It left us feeling that we were less than, and we have to change that. I mean, the notion that Governor Kofi committed suicide was related to me as a huge negative. Look at that coward. That's what he did. But when one puts it into the context of his experience, his understanding of who he was as a governor and what his responsibilities are in that role, if he finds that he no longer has the support of the leadership and the people, he must commit suicide in front of others so that they can witness and be able to tell the people that no one killed him. There's no internecine warfare here. This man, leader, committed suicide. What she did not go into details in the lecture is that he had a very grand funeral. It was a grand affair, his funeral. And so that comes out of the Yoruba West African tradition. So he committed suicide in an honorable way and was buried with all of the rights of a superior leader who had done well for his people, right? So that story, as you said, David, and for me, I can say the same. Had I been told that story as a child, I would have had a whole different perspective on me as an individual in Guyana and the pride with which we should feel about what we have done. The second thing that I think that her lecture does, it gives us, of course, she is looking in retrospect. These are things that happened, etc. It should lead us to be introspective. What about this history that we've learned should we take and bring to today? Right? It requires us to be introspective about who we are, how we present ourselves in this space that we call Guyana, our sense of agency, the power with which we should operate. We are still in many ways operating. Our ancestors, those who fought, yes, those who fought and died, those 1,800 people, do you think that, how would they feel about how we are today? I mean, that's the kind of thinking I think we need to be doing. We need to be thinking about, they fought and died because they had a belief they wanted to be free. And they began to design and created a state and held out against the Dutch for 18 months, over 18 months, and were finally defeated by a combined force of Europeans. Remember, it was not just the Dutch. The Dutch also used British and
British
other
from Barbados and St. Eustatius.
Exactly, that were in the Caribbean, right? And they also relied on their allies, the Amerindians, who in many ways created a cordon where our people could not go. They were barricaded into a space.
Right.
And then of course, Amerindians that were known to have beheaded, cut off the hands, done all of the work that would have made it very difficult for our people to those who wished to save their lives it was not possible. In the end, it was hunger and lack of arms that forced them into that really created the situation that led to the dissolution of the resolution. I will not say that they were defeated. I would say and obviously I'm not a
Well,
historian.
Olive, they're not defeated because today Kofi is our national hero, Governor Kofi.
Governor Kofi, yes,
Kofi.
our national hero, exactly. Is our national hero. Absolutely, I agree. So the dissolution of the
Yes.
revolution and the continued fight for freedom, which we carry forward today. I want to say two things. I want to respond to Richie, who asked about the access to the documents. Among the documents she used were the records of the interrogations of the 900 persons, Africans who were recaptured. 900 interrogations over a period of about, I think they began in March and ended sometime in late July. And the Dutch, in their governance style, was that of record keeping and being very meticulous. And they recorded every single interrogation. They gave the name of the person, the date of the interrogation, the name of the person who was being interrogated, and the plantation from which they came. And they usually ask them one, but never more than two questions. So that very important record does many things. It gives us the names of persons who hitherto we had no access to knowing who they were. And from some of the names, you do some research, you can figure out where they were from on the West Coast
Right.
of Africa. What plantation they were on, and then what were they doing during the revolution. Now, people were trying to save their lives because some people ended up being killed as a result. So their responses are very, very strategic and very careful. But we have those. That record was presented to Ipadaji. Of all 900 now translated into English, was presented to Ipadaji through a memorandum of understanding that we have signed with the National Dutch Archives. And so we have the copy of all of those 900 names, and we used some of those at the event last Saturday. We created little cards, and on each card, and each person that came got a card that had one of the names of the persons who were interrogated, what the plantation was that they were from, and the questions they were asked and the response. So in a way, we are going to use this record to bring those people back to life, to give life to those who fought for us, those whose bones are buried in the bush that we need to take care of on the Berbice River. Which brings me to my penultimate point, and that is the creation of national sites. You mentioned, David, and I believe you alluded to it, Eric, the fact that the Europeans they extol their history. They create monuments and parks and all kinds of things. And in the United States, I mean, everything that has to do with the Civil War, there's a monument
Memorialized,
totally memorialized. Here we have Bush. And that's unacceptable. We as Africans should feel insulted. We should be offended that a place that was the birthplace of this nation, where Africans died fighting for freedom, is nothing but bush.
Bush. Yes.
Nothing but bush. That is an insult.
Olive, I also want to add that when we looked at 1823, a similar thing occurred when they interviewed those captured Africans after the fight. And the Council for World Mission at SOAS, the University College of Life of London, they have 35,000 items about the 1823, and they have the interviews of those people. So we need to capture that and consolidate it into some process that allows us to keep those people's names and spirit alive. And the other thing I wanted to add, if you look at Philip Moore's interpretation of Governor Kofi and the symbolism around that monument, which most of us don't even know exists, he captured everything about their lived experiences at the time. And yet, in the middle of it, he spoke about love, Ubuntu. I am because you are. And coming back to your earlier statement at the beginning, David, about what Pan-Africanism is and all of that, and that there's an African narrative that's independent of whether you are in an environment with Indians or Chinese. There's African philosophical thought and African sociological thought that is in our DNA. And the spirit of Ubuntu is now really the same as the Pan-African spirit. I was just in Brazil, and that's where we came out. That Pan-Africanism or global Africa is about the spirit of Ubuntu. But it goes back to knowing who you are and that you're African. And this is what we have lost in Guyana because we don't understand our history. We were ashamed of Governor Kofi. We were ashamed of all of our heroes. And so we don't have our young people going and admiring the statue or wanting to go and see the site that is now desecrated and just bush. And we don't have political parties demanding that this is our national heritage. And if we're going to build a society, we need to build a society with all of these monuments, whether they're Amerindian or African or Indian or Chinese. We all have done lots of things to make us who we are. But we have had a narrative of division, and it's in our constitution. I mean, today I responded to Ravi Dev, who was saying that we're not an autocratic society. Well, in 1763, Guyana was autocratic. Yeah. In 1823, it was autocratic. Right. In 1838, with Damon, it was autocratic. At independence, it was autocratic. That's why the British were able to get rid of the constitution and Chedi Jagan. Winner take all is autocratic. So when we go through all this gymnastics talking about democracy versus whether it's an autocracy, we are an autocratic society by institutional design and by historical design. So I don't know why Ravi and Ram Karan and Ram Charan and all of these are trying to lie to us. We have evolved in an autocratic state, and winner take all sort of memorializes that. And we need to be honest. And if we were to teach our history, and going back to Governor Kofi saying, hey, I don't want to fight with you, regardless of what you've done to me. Let us live peacefully together. Yes. Let us trade. I would trade with you. You could trade with me. We need the riverways. You know, it would have been a very different society. And when indentureship occurred, I mean, people forgot that mainly men came, Indian men, and it was African women who took them in and nurtured them. All of that is lost in this narrative of division.
Mm-hmm. Chief Eric Phillips there, and as you speak about Kofi, in an African democratic way, wanting to share the colony with his oppressors. With his oppressors, wanting to share. And we are living in Guyana. Indians never enslave African people. African people never enslave Indian people. Amerindian people never enslave Africans. Yes, they played a particular role at a particular time in our history, which we must acknowledge and put in context. But we never enslaved each other. And in 1961, Sidney King is talking about joint premiership. If Kofi could have talked about a joint existence with his oppressors, Sidney King takes it to bring it into the model. Joint premiership with our two major ethnic groups, the leaders of our two major ethnic groups. We have updated it today to shared governance, no winner take all. It comes out of the African tradition. It's part of our gift to Guyana's understanding of its complexity. Kofi understood it in 1763.
Yeah.
And it was not as complex as it is today. And if people like Ravi Dev were to study that and understand, they will stop throwing stones at us who are trying to bring the African experience into the mainstream of Guyanese thought and action.
But David, it's more than that.
Yes, go
We're
ahead.
trying to make sure that Guyana does not become the colony of another country, which is what we are becoming. Because we are divided, we are being manipulated by foreign interests. If we had a common vision, we would have had a different contract with Exxon. But one group doing it, the other group doing it. Same thing here with our national budget, with the sovereign wealth fund. We have one group completely excluded from designing how we should all benefit. It's the same thing that Coffee was trying to tell us. Let us share the space, let us include each other, and we've not learned those lessons.
You're right. You're
Yes,
right, Eric. We're
yes,
right back
yes, yes. Go ahead, Olive.
no, we're right back to where we were
Mhm.
with the situation with the Dutch. Here we are, and we have, and I mean, we really should see that's the battle. Those are how the battle lines are drawn. We are where we are as African Guyanese now, confronting the new Dutch and
Yes,
saying to them, we deserve a space in this society
because of the blood in the river.
develop our yeah to develop our to be a part of the economy that develops for us, benefiting us as it benefits others, not to be. And because Kofi never said we are going to deprive one group in favor of ourselves, it was very egalitarian, and it was in the spirit as of Ubuntu.
Yes. But Olive, look at it this way. Look at the recent results. Our children are failing math and English, and we're getting into a high-tech AI oil-driven high economy. In 10 years, we will be the laborers of Guyana,
That's where
and
we are
others
already,
and
Eric.
others
We're
will be
here.
taking over the economy.
We're
And,
here.
and, and whether you're Indian or Chinese or African, it's not going to be a Guyanese economy. And we don't seem to understand that. We need to come together now and plan. As you know, Nigel said, we need a 15-year plan. We do need that. And we update it every 5 years. We do need to understand what the geopolitical forces are. We need to understand what's going on in Israel and Gaza, how that's going to impact the geopolitics of this region.
Yeah.
And we're not, because we're too focused on racial division and federalism and things that are political gestures of division.
But Eric, I think the bottom line is that we somehow, it appears as though nation building has gone out the window. So all of the things you just referred to are a matter of building a
Yeah,
nation. Are we
yeah.
building a nation, or are we just a commercial hub? Are
A
we just,
colony.
yeah, is this just an opportunity to move money from the public purse into private hands anywhere in the world? Right?
Yes.
I go into the supermarkets, allow me this slight digression, but to that point. And I am saddened by the fact that all of the efforts at import substitution, all of the efforts at trying to build our own agriculture, our own agro processing, is being pushed aside in preference for importing, which is what we had when we were a colony. We had to
That's
import
what
it.
destroyed Venezuela. 85% of their food became imported because of their oil wealth. And we are becoming like Venezuela. Because when oil prices dropped, Venezuela suffered because they stopped import substitution. They stopped growing their own food. And that's where we are heading. And we're doing this because we don't understand Venezuela. We don't understand what oil economies go through. It's quite critical. And one thing I want to add, Olive, and I know you and David would understand this. We hear this thing about the GDP being moving from 6,000 to 20,000, the fastest growing economy in the world. Well, we are being lied to because the GDP is the total amount of oil revenues, and we're only getting 14.5%. So to say that this GDP is growing by this month, most of the GDP is owned by Exxon and CNOC and Hess.
Mhm.
And that's why our people can barely survive, because the money that we're getting in Guyana is 14.5 cents a dollar.
Well, let me say this. I think that I encourage all of us at Epatagy, on this, us on the panel, the audience, to step back. Go to our Facebook page, listen to Professor Carr's remarks, and look at where we are today. It seems as though we are in phase two of that battle that Governor Kofi was involved in. We are in phase
Yep.
two.
Yep.
And what are we going to do now that we are in this phase? We know that first phase. We can look around us and see where we are and how the battle has been joined. We have not necessarily joined it, but the battle has been declared.
Yes.
What are we going to do to carry forward the battle that Kofi began for
Oliver
true
and David, the sad thing is that our
freedom?
politicians don't know history. So they don't understand the context in which we are. You and I and David and others on this call can recognize the battle has started, but they haven't, because they don't understand what happened in 1763 or 1823, or what happened even before 1763. In 1762, there was a
There was a
eruption.
similar battle in the 70s. But Eric, one thing that says though, I, you know, we, Kofi was working on a plantation, Lillienburg, and he led a revolution, right? We must not put, politicians are not gladiators. We don't pay them to go into the ring and fight our fights. We have to fight our own fight. And everybody has a role to play. With every decision that we make on how we spend our money, that's a part of the battle. Where are we putting our money in this fight? Right? What choices do we make when we go to the market? Who are we supporting? I'm not trying to be racist or separatist, but I'm saying that there is a fight that we have to be really strategic in how we engage, and we have to fight the fight as individuals and from the ground up to show our politicians what it is that we want.
But
We
Olive,
have to
they're
drive
putting
that.
things in place that are hamstringing us. I'm not being racial, I'm just being realistic. We, all of our native supermarkets are dying. It's mind-boggling how one of the few entry strategies or entry areas for our young Guyanese of all races to get a start is being taken away. These are the things that, if you're nation building, you should understand of that 10% of Guyanese never went to school. This is the Guyana Labor Studies, right? 24% only have primary education, 28% secondary education, and 0.2% degrees. If you have a work profile like that, and you have an educational system where 70% are failing math and English, and you're looking at this economy, we have to realign the economy through policies, through public policies. And I'm not seeing that. I mean, what is going on again with Chinese supermarkets happened in Suriname. We should have learned that. But the point I'm making is that, as much as I agree with you that we have to fight the fight individually and collectively by our actions, a lot of what needs to have happened or to happen is not happening because of the lack of understanding of where Guyana is and what's going on to our own people of all races. We are being excluded from this economy slowly, slowly, slowly. And those who are making a lot of money don't care. But the bottom line is that 10 years from now, when you look at a Guyanese coming out of UG or any university, and you ask them, where are my opportunities for entrepreneurship? There are none, because entrepreneurship today is not about planting chips and that. It's about technology. It's about AI driven solutions. It's high tech. And if you're failing math and English, you cannot participate in that. And this is the type of public policy and realignment of our educational system that we are not pursuing because we have not understood 1763 and what was going on there. We have not understood 1823, and we really don't understand what happened in Venezuela. If we were to study Venezuela's economy, the GDP is today in Venezuela is what it had in 1953. That's where Venezuela is. And Venezuela suffered dramatically because we stopped growing food. Same thing you're saying. We stopped, we are buying everything foreign and we
Yeah.
can't even afford it. We should
Yeah.
be growing. Agriculture is still a core business. Food,
It's
climate
essential.
change, resilient crops, grow up, feed, and house yourself. We are not doing basic things because we have not learned our history.
Or we were so busy putting down Forbes Burnham that we couldn't do something what he did that was beneficial. But we
Yes,
have to destroy that.
yes.
But Eric, I think that programs like this and that David allows persons like yourself and others to come on, and the attentive audience, I think slowly but surely change will come because of the opportunities that these programs provide.
And the Guyanese are intelligent people intuitively. I mean, I've always argued, even though the school system is making me a liar now, that on a per capita basis, we are some of the brightest people in the world. It's in us, the village movement, what we did during indentureship to grow this economy. That's who we are. But it's being taken away from us because we don't understand we're in phase 2 of this war.
Yeah.
Chief Eric Phillips here tonight, along with Sister Olive Sampson, the CEO of IPADG. Continue our discussion, which we began last week, on the significance of the 1763 revolution and the way in which we are situating and locating that moment in the larger scheme of things, the larger nation building that has occurred from since then. And we brought it into the present tonight to say some of the questions, some of the issues that the revolutionaries confronted in 1763 are the very issues that we confronted. How to survive in a larger global economy that is geared to keep us in our place. Kofi had an answer to it. The question I think Eric is asking, and Olive here tonight, is whether our present day rulers, our present day governors have the insight that Kofi had in 1763. Whether they have it or don't have it, the evidence is there. We have the book Blood on the River. We had a book before that was useful, but the Blood on the River is more to the point. We are now having more and more information and perspective on our history. We are all of our history. And if we cut ourselves off from our history, we cut ourselves off from our birthright. And so therefore we can see the
parallels.
Yes.
Even oil is today's sugar
Yes.
of 1763, because the conditions are all the same. Guyanese, who at that time were people of African descent, are suffering. Guyanese of all races are suffering today at the supermarket in terms of dealing with inflation, in terms of salaries being squeezed, in terms of opportunities that are empowering. And one of the things we're absolutely missing here, David and Olive, is the role of women. We have lost that in our history, but they were just as strategic in all the decision making in the spirit of community. And we've forgotten that the first village was bought by 83 people, of which 5 were women, and they were from 4 different plantations, and they didn't even know each other. And that shows that we have this ability to come together to work as community. But again, when we look at the village movement, we don't look at it in this historical context, in this analytical context. It was about freedom. It was about a new way of life. It was about community. It was about male and women, male and female working together. It was about economic sustainability. It was about spiritual revival. all those types of things. That's what the village movement was about. It wasn't just about buying land and creating villages. It was a broader concept of freedom and a new beginning. And shared governance, which is what Governor Kofi was preaching, was about a new beginning.
Chief Eric Phillips. Sister Olive, your closing thoughts.
Well, I want to go back to an earlier point, and that is this is an opportunity for us to think about where we are in this new phase of the revolution. We are exactly where Kofi was in 1764. Towards the end, this is the revolution begins in 1763, continues into 1764. We are faced with the same struggle, right? Where our forces are being depleted, and we have to fight for our survival. We absolutely have to fight, and every single person has a role to play. Every person has a role to play, and we don't have time to point fingers at anyone. We've got to speak to our leaders and help them understand what it is we want and what it is we are willing to do, not just to put them out there, but what are we willing to do to support their action, right?
Yeah.
I want to just say too that we at Ipadagy were very pleased to have been able to bring Professor Cars here and to have the event on Saturday. We also had an event on Friday for students, very small, but it was also carried on our Facebook page. I encourage people to look at that as well, because it dealt not only with 1763, it was broader, and the students' questions were very good. But I want to take this opportunity to again thank Hughes, Fields, and Stobie, particularly Nigel Hughes, for being the sponsor of CAR's visit to Guyana and of that program that we were able to hold for the students and on Saturday at the Theatre Guild. As everyone knows, Ipadagy does not have its subvention anymore. Had we had a subvention, we would have done this and much more, many other kinds of programs. I just want to thank Nigel Hughes and Hughes, Fields, and Stobie, and others like Liana Kane and other companies that supported our work.
Chief Eric, your closing thoughts?
I would like to first of all thank Ipadagy and Nigel Hughes and all the sponsors for bringing this event here. It's at an opportune time. The question Olive is asking is, are we ready to understand the circumstances we're in and to act accordingly? I think we need to understand that Guyana is a country of massive resources. We can grow over 200 fruits and vegetables. We have 319 waterfalls. We can go on and on and on. We're geopolitically placed, the only English-speaking country in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have an incredible opportunity to create a new society, one that the world can model. And in order to do that, we have to understand our history, and we have to understand the needs of our people. And we also need to understand the geopolitical forces driving us. And if we do, we have an opportunity to create something special. In the same way that the village movement was the greatest entrepreneurial event in any post-slavery society, we as Guyanese of all races have an opportunity to do something similar if we only seize the chance. So I'm thankful that Ipadagy and Nigel and you, David, for this show, to have conversation that's relevant and not conversation that digresses into racism and who is superior and who is this, because that's what our oppressors, who we are not seeing, we're not even seeing the real oppressors. That's what they want, and that's what they did with divide and rule, and that's why we have that autocratic DNA from 1763 until today in a winner-take-all system.
Thank you very much, Chief Eric Phillips, Sister Olive Sampson tonight, enriching our discussion as usual. Chief Eric, the fellows over that side were surprised that we have African chiefs in Guyana and were endeavoring to give us advice that as African chiefs, we need to moderate our tone. And so the whole colonial, condescending, paternalistic thing that they have to tell our African chiefs how to conduct. We are chiefs because we are free people. Nobody to tell us how we must talk and how we must behave. My brother, thank you very much, Sister Olive. Always great service to our country, great service to our race, great service to our Caribbean, great service to the African diaspora, and ultimately, we are still teaching the world something coming out of our experience. Thank you all so much for coming on.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
And to your audience, invaluable. Without you, we can't do this. You're here. You're here always, always with us. And to Puran, thank you very much. My brother, keep on staying with us. And to our Indian Guyanese brothers and sisters in the audience, our Chinese, Portuguese, and especially our indigenous people who are on this program quietly absorbing the conversation, absorbing the discourse. We are eternally grateful. Thank you all, and I'll see you all tomorrow. We're going to have Paul Slow on tomorrow. For those of you who are cricket fans, well, Etmaya is on fire, so go over there and enjoy some of the Etmaya treat. It's been long coming. So good night, and I'll see you all tomorrow with Brother Paul Slow.